Welcome to Valhalla Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Becky Hill, otherwise known as Soul Chaser Becky, and I am a proud Viking geek. I fell in love with the history, culture and mythology of the Viking Age, and I have been on an endless quest for more ever since. Join me as I discuss all things Norse with those who have been inspired by Viking Age history and Norse mythology in their creative works, or those who have studied the sagas and archaeology, and review how such subjects are being presented to modern audiences today. If you like Viking stuff, you are welcome in my Valhalla, and I hope you stay for the conversation. Welcome everyone to Valhalla Conversations podcast, where we like to talk all things North, the past, the current, the history, the mythology, popular culture and everything else in between. And I'm delighted to welcome this episode's guest, Dr Roderick Dale, and he's joining me all the way from Stavanger in Norway. Welcome, Roderick.
Thank you for having me.
Now, me and Rory have a bit of a personal connection going back quite a few years now, because I first met Rory at the Unlocking the Viking symposium or conference, one of the two. It was over a couple of days back in the UK. I can't remember, was that at the University of Nottingham? Or was that?
It was at Nottingham, yeah.
It was at Nottingham, yes. That's where I first met you and learnt about your own passionate interests and professional studies. And of course, we've both kind of gone on to do other things since. I will read for you, dear listeners and dear viewers, his bio from his book, The Myths and Realities of the Viking Berserkr, which is available from Routledge. And he's worked as an archaeologist throughout the United Kingdom and in research roles at the University College of Cork in Ireland and the University of Nottingham here in the UK. He currently works at the University of Stavanger in Norway, and his research interests include Old Norse literature, Viking Age history, and the reception of Vikings in popular culture. Now, I know for a fact, because we've been keeping in touch all these years, as you can tell, because I've roped you back in onto the podcast, that after we first met at Nottingham all those years ago at the Unlocking the Vikings conference, you went on to your job at the University of Cork in Ireland and had a bit of a role in the Project World Tree, which always fascinated me, and I know I contributed a little bit to that because it was about the modern representation of Vikings in modern day culture. Would you mind telling our viewers and listeners more about it?
Yeah, the World Tree Project was a fantastic opportunity to find out what people think Vikings are. The project was based around getting people to submit Viking related items that would then be part of an online database that could be used as teaching tools. So what we learned from it was that it's Vikings are everywhere. That was what we learned from it. And essentially, people found loaves of bread with God's names on, or packets of potato flour with Odin's name on, or things like that. Viking taxis and Viking pizzas were everywhere. And a lot of these, so it was Tom Burkett's baby. He's the one who came up with the idea and got the funding for it. He's still at University College Cork and he's working on a new project now, Norse Map. We work closely together across the UK, Ireland, Denmark and Norway. Developing a community collection initiative where people would spot Vikings in the wild, as it were, send them to us. We would add them with notes to the website, and they're then available for teaching purposes. But also what it gave us was a very close look at reception of Vikings in modern culture. So when we're looking at it, we're thinking, why is it Viking river cruises, for example? But then you're plundering the heritage of the area in a metaphorical sense. And Viking taxis, are you really going to get into a Viking taxi? And So that was what we were working on. The website, last I looked, was still up. I haven't actually checked in a while, I must admit,
Mm-hmm.
but it's available. We got given people who worked in academia let us have some notes that could be used as teaching resources about the Vikings, and it included a wide variety of different types of um, thing, for want of a better word, that is
Mm-hmm.
Viking related.
Mm. It's certainly a fascinating area, and I remember being in a fish and chip shop in my hometown of Huddersfield and seeing kind of like on the window, kind of like a stylized Viking longship, and photographing that and sending that in, as well as when I went to see York Minster and they had a digitized copy of the Gospel of York. Gospel of York? No, not the Gospel of York. It'll be an old book to do with York Minster, and they had the pages of where Emma and King Canute had visited. And I remember taking photos of that and sending it in. But because I did follow it with great interest, because it is remarkable how much Vikings are not just a people of history, their own culture, their own mythology and all that, but they are very much a brand now. It's amazing what connotations are applied when you have the word Viking in front of a business or a product or a service.
Oh yeah, I mean that's something that we found. For example, Viking tires are hard wearing. You know, um, and a lot of the things that have a Viking related name to them build on the mythology of the Vikings, or the myth of the Vikings. The idea that they're adventurous, hardy, go places nobody else does, and that they survive.
Mm,
So they were they bring to mind a lot of different things that aren't necessarily what the historical Vikings are. To some extent,
mm,
there are two types of Viking in the world. There's the historical Viking and there's the Viking brand. And the
mm-hmm.
Viking brand has horned helmets and the historical
Oh yeah,
Viking doesn't. You
oh
know, how
yes,
do you know they're Vikings? How do you know they're Vikings if they don't have horned helmets?
mm-hmm. It is.
So yeah,
That is a very good point. That there are two types of Viking. I'm sure, kind of like if that project were just kind of like an eternal database where people could contribute for years and years to come, it would be fascinating to look at it in 100 years' time and see how that image has evolved or continued to evolve, or whether it's just stuck and it continues to repeat the same characteristics and types.
it's very interesting. You can actually see it if you compare older online searches for Viking versus the
Mm,
ones that you see now. It's very clear that TV programs like Vikings have influenced how
mm,
Vikings look in pop culture. So you can go online and do a search. And I did that for an article I've written recently, which I hope will get published. And it showed that modern Vikings are much darker and muddier. Older
oh,
Vikings were very much shampoo adverts with flowing golden blonde hair and
mm.
very much looking like beefcake men, a lot of them. And now they all look like Travis Fimmel.
Oh, it's made me actually remember that. Was it last week? It was last week when I did my weekly food shop. There was an energy drink brand, and I can't remember the name of the brand, but they had a new flavor coming out called Viking Berries, and it had very stereotypical cartoonesque artwork of a male Viking, horned helmet. He had a round shield, he had a sword, he also had two axes on his back, which I thought was a bit of an overkill. He was surrounded by skulls, also with horned helmets on, so it's kind of like the question of like who killed these Vikings. And then on the opposite side of the can was what I guess you could call a shield maiden, although she wasn't wielding a shield, she had an axe of her own, a two-handed one, and a wolf, just to make her look even more fearsome. And of course, a longship in the background with more horned helmets popping out. And I did send it into the Nordic Mythology podcast Discord tube. So have you seen this Viking drink? It looks horrible. Horrible. I mean, what's this guy got two axes for when he's already got a shield and a sword?
Well, you've got to have spares just in case you lose it in the middle of the battle.
But that it really represents, as you say, that brand image that people have now of Vikings. And it's certainly kind of like when I think back to kind of like more innocent representations, such as Cressida Cowell's How to Train Your Dragon, all her Vikings have horn helmets, even though at first in the live action adaptation of her book, they do look genuinely ridiculous. So you can kind of see why horned helmets would not work in any battle shape or existence in the world. But it's that motif, that iconography that's kind of stuck to it.
Yeah.
Very much like how Valkyries are kind of figures of beauty and ethereal allure, and kind of like you dream of going off with one, you don't really dread going off with one, considering it means you die. Kind of like, who would want to? It's there's so much, and I would certainly kind of like love. I think I will have to go back to Project Unison and just have a more nosy on that website, because there was so much more on there than the little bits that I put on. And as you mentioned, Tom Burkett is now working on the Norse map, which seems to be an even bigger bubble, so to speak, looking again at representation of Vikings, and in some ways their mythology as well, not just their historical representations, but across literature and art and music. And I was so jealous every time he advertised for a PhD funded placement. I'm like, I would if I could, but I don't have the degrees or the qualifications or the time, especially now that I've got a baby waiting to come out for me in the summer. So I will be following that project with great interest. It's just a shame it's still early days, otherwise I'd have had him on as well on the podcast, but I might, maybe at a later date when he's got some data to show off. Because it's fascinating to think how our 20th century minds have morphed and amalgamated people from the time. You have to think kind of like, how do people in the future amalgamate us as 20th century folk? Because it must happen at some point. We can't always kind of like be the kind of the innocent party and not change in some representation.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, that's it. And what will be interesting in the future is which bits of our culture and who will be the people that are representative of it to those people of the future, much like we get with the Vikings, where the focus is always on the elites. So all we hear about is Viking warriors, and we don't hear about Viking pig farmers often enough.
That's true. Or the fishermen, or the boat builders. And all, like as you say, kind of like there must be sheep farmers, because I know kind of like they used wool a lot in their sails, and it took a lot of sheep's wool to make just one sail. So that's a whole industry of people there doing that job, but no one really knows about it. I think that's one thing I always liked about when there have been big Viking exhibitions like the one at the British Museum over a decade ago now, which I still can't believe, but I was lucky enough to go there. And you get to see, or even in the York Museum actually in York there, I think they've got a plank of wood where you can just see someone's carved out the lines to play Hnafatafl. Even though it's kind of seen as a elite game, more common people knew the rules, would probably use stones or rocks or shiny pebbles as the pieces.
Well, I mean, National Museum of Ireland in Dublin basically has a rock with, I don't think it's a Hnafatafl, I think it's a Merrill's board, so a 9 men's Morris board, basically scratched onto it. I mean, we say it's an elite game, but these games were played by almost everybody. We have evidence from the sagas of people sitting around playing games, including the women, so therefore, you know, it's not just burly macho warriors sitting in the hall getting drunk and playing board games. It's everybody. I mean, people are always going to play games, and games like those are really easy because you scratch a board on the ground, grab some rocks, somebody else grabs some different bits and pieces, and you can play.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's made me think back to when finds from the Torksey winter camp were found, and they found kind of like hundreds, if not thousands, of dice in like big shapes, little ones. There's some tiny little dice, and kind of like they were probably using gambling or other types of games, yet they all got lost somehow or just discarded when they got moved on. Kind of like the D&D player in me kind of thinks I would never lose my dice like that. These dice are kind of like staying in my set D&D bag. They're not going to get lost and buried underground and found hundreds of years later. But
There's always one die that disappears under the sofa and never re-emerges.
Oh yes. Or
But,
the
but I
dreaded
mean,
D4 when you step on it.
oh, ouch, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, worse than Lego. But yeah, I mean, the gaming pieces from Torksey, we've realised that they're diagnostic of Viking Age activity as well. So they're not just found at Torksey, and they just look like little lead thimbles, and they're everywhere too. So yeah, people were sitting around playing games in these camps. And I say camps, I mean, Torksey was big enough to be a town.
It was. They
So
obviously had like their own followers that would come through. I think there was evidence of Smith working there, obviously to repair bits of buckles or repair swords and other stuff. So it was quite kind of like, as you say, it was kind of, if not a town, definitely at least a mobile village of main warriors, but all the people who supported those warriors, almost like groupies, so to speak. Like the people who cooked, the people who hunted, the people who put up the tents, put them down again.
not
Yeah.
just groupies, also merchants.
Mm.
Basically, they found the various dodecahedral weights. I think they are
Yes.
dodecahedral.
Mm.
Um, that have their origins in Middle Eastern weight types. So there were merchants there. There's evidence for women there, which means there's evidence for
Mm-hmm.
children there. You know, I mean, it was a town. I mean, they estimate Torksey had a population of around 5,000 people or something. You know, that's a fairly large town by that time's standards.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there was everybody there.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, an entire support network of people who saw an opportunity to get rich quick off the people who were actually in the army.
Mm. It's certainly a better version of kind of like engagement more than having them turn up at your village and start burning your house down on stealing all your pigs because they need the pigs to feed their army. Kind of like, I'll sell you my pig if you give me some gold for it.
Yeah. Oh
Or
yeah,
silver, I should say, more than gold.
more likely silver, but yeah, yeah, I'm sure they
Yeah.
wouldn't turn their noses up at gold either.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, so we've got all that evidence, and you know, and these types of artifacts are found scattered all around that area as well. The metal detectors have found and reported quite a few that show where people were. And it's instructive to see how many of them are alongside the rivers, so you can see that people, you know, that the Great Army was using the rivers like we would use the A1 or the M1.
Yeah, because those ships were formidable at going up the rivers in ways that other previously kind of like other big war ships or invading armies couldn't, which of
Yeah.
course is one of the keys to Viking success. Coming back to Project World Tree, you mentioned how it had input not just from the UK and Ireland, but also from Norway. Did you ever notice any differences between how Vikings were represented in obviously their native Scandinavia compared to the British Isles, where they kind of have the kind of like the good bad boy image, so to speak? They're the bad guys from history that everyone likes.
Not really. There are some things that are different. Names of gods from Norse mythology are more common on everyday items. So that kind of thing. But generally speaking, the same attributes that make them popular in the UK are the ones that make them popular in Scandinavia and also in the Norwegian settled areas or the Norse settled areas of America.
Interesting. Because I've always kind of like wondered what it must be like to grow up having that culture as part of your national identity, and then wondering whether they kind of like, hey, they have a particular view or stance on it compared to people where the Vikings invaded and settled more than actually kind of naturally flourished as a society.
Yeah, that's a good question. I should ask my colleagues. What do you think about Vikings, Halvor? Yeah, no. I genuinely don't know how Vikings are received here in that way. I think they're just part of the culture. I mean, I know that just 3 miles down the road from me, the Battle of Hofsfjord was fought. I know some people call it into question whether it actually was fought there, but And there's information boards up about it that present information that I don't entirely agree with, about dates and things like that. And there's a monument, the Swords in the Rock, to commemorate it. So these kinds of things are found all over. The local archaeological museum has an amazing collection of runestones in it, as well as some lovely Viking Age finds, including gold. But I'm not convinced that people think too hard about the Vikings. They just are.
Yeah. I wonder if that's almost kind of like the way us Brits treat the Anglo-Saxons a bit. Like, yeah, we had the Anglo-Saxons, we had King Alfred, and then we had King Athelstan, and eventually become one big country, etc., etc., etc. Kind of like, it's because we're taught it all at such a young age at school, we're kind of like not too fussed about it when we're all adults and we're seeing it pop up on history channels or on history dramas, kind of thing. Certainly it makes me think to an advert for wearing bicycle helmets, which made me chuckle, that Northsmith user on Facebook shared, where it's set in the Viking Age and this guy's going to ride off and join his troop to go and, well, not his troop, his kind of like shipmates on a ship to go raiding. And his kind of like son comes out saying, "Are you not going to wear your helmet?" He goes, no, it'll damage my braids, it'll damage my hair. I was like, yeah, but it's not going to protect you from arrows or anything. So can you like just put it on? And his wife eventually comes out with the baby saying, "Look, will you just put it on so you can come back?" and then I'm not having to wait for it to find out whether you've been shot in the head by an arrow. And I thought that was a really clever interpretation of reflecting kind of like the safety value of wearing a bicycle helmet, both for bikes and motorbikes, of course. I think it was primarily in motorbikes this case. But kind of like the idea of Vikings wearing helmets, because of course we've got the ever-ending myth of them having horned helmets. But I think I was chatting to another previous guest, CJ Adrian, and he said there's only been one genuine Viking Age helmet ever found, which I found equally mind-blowing. I thought, well, why has this concept come from that they all had helmets, if not chainmail or mail, I should suppose, because it's not chainmail, it's mail. Another thing I learned recently.
I mean, yeah.
That was equally rare.
Yeah, the only nearly complete Viking Age helmet ever found is the Yarmundbu helmet from Norway. And it's the spectacle style helmet that you sometimes see. There have been eyebrows found. The sort of, I'm waving my hands around like people will be able to see what I'm doing here. But basically, the ridged brows of helmets have been found. There's a couple from Denmark that I know of. And they remind quite a bit of the Vendel era helmets. But the Yarmundbu helmet is quite plain, so it lacks all the decorative helmet plates and everything else. So yeah, we only have that one helmet. It doesn't have horns on it, so they obviously took them off before they threw it away, or maybe they fell off, and that's why they threw it away. But as Roberta Frank outlined quite a while ago, the real influence is Wagner here.
Oh yes,
The chorus,
we could have a whole episode talking about him.
But the chorus of Das Nibelungenlied, the Ring Cycle, the chorus of the Ring Cycle all wore horned helmets. The gods don't wear horned helmets, and we see that in the iconography as well. But the everyday Vikings all have horned helmets, and that's where it comes from. But that's also interesting because that's where the Valkyrie iconography comes from too.
Oh yeah.
Amalia Materna, was it? With her winged helmet. And that just goes all the way through. You see it in the 1928 The Viking, all the way through to Xena Warrior Princess. And they all have that winged helmet when they're being Valkyries. So Wagner, well, Carl Doppler's designs for Wagner, massively influential. And I know I've had this argument with people when Twitter was a thing, who said, "Oh, it's not Wagner because the Valkyries don't have horned helmets." And it's like, Valkyries are a completely different iconography. They're a completely different stereotype to the Vikings that were the chorus and the gods with their winged helmets as well. So that's where it comes from, and I have no idea why that was so influential, but it was.
Well, as you know, I kind of happened to join you in Stavanger 2 years ago now. Share my crazy fan theories about Valkyries in fiction, and I didn't quite get to touch on the iconography of their design, but I do in the article that is hopefully, keeping my double fingers crossed here, folks, going to get through to publication and see the light of day after 2 years of work. And I did dive a bit deeper into where kind of like these modern day authors find this attiring their Valkyries, and a lot of it does of course stem from the winged helmet look from Wagner. Only one of them actually adapts the winged helmet look to be more almost like centurion cheek plates, because she has the wings coming down along the cheeks instead of being up and upright and flapping about and getting caught in all sorts, I suspect. But I know I looked at Alberto Delgado's book about Viking films, and he has a small section on Wagner, but also about the winged helmet being used to represent the protagonist, the hero. And that's actually got Celtic roots to do with a series of Celtic poetry. It didn't last with the Vikings as film characters in their own right, but it did transfer, as you say, to the Valkyries, and it's been with them ever since. It's never really left. But I think, what's his name? There's another academic that is in Spain, and I've forgotten his name, but he had written an article a couple of years ago about Viking representation in 18th and 19th century art, and he found that there was a painting, a mural, I think it was in a museum in Berlin before Wagner's cycle started, that depicts Tyr, the god of war, and he's got two Valkyries, question mark, either side of him, and they've got winged helmets, because of course their connotation with war was more recognized in that sense. And I think that's one thing that's definitely been lost with the Valkyrie iconography compared to the Viking iconography. Vikings are always at war, they're always killing people, raiding, pillaging. The Valkyries are kind of more beautiful, strong, independent women, which is a more 20th century edition than actually being kind of like the bloodthirsty, curdling kind of like horrors that they were supposedly more like to the people of the time when these myths and legends were told. But that's just a tip of an iceberg. I would love to do much more research on winged helmets. It'll be awesome to see if I can find out when it started. Who put them on compared to who put the horns on the helmet.
Winged helmets as well, and similar helmets are all generic barbarian traits prior to Wagner. So there's a lot of that going on. I've not looked into it in any detail, so yeah, there's plenty of room for you to do that. Please go ahead. But there's this idea of barbarians, in 19th century idea of barbarians, that they all have these winged helmets and similar. So they all look a bit like Asterix.
Yeah. I mean, now that you've mentioned that, it's also made me think of Eric the Viking, written by one of the gang from Monty Python. I've forgotten his name, and it's all
Terry Gilliam?
No, it's the other one, the one that sadly died. I think he had Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Oh, I'm going to get it off my shelf. 1 second. Can't not name him. That's embarrassing. Terry Jones. I knew it was Terry. But his hero in his book, and it is a really delightful kids' book, very, very, very reminiscent of Icelandic sagas, but much more fun. And his hero also has winged helmets in the illustration. So even he's carrying on that motif of winged helmets, signaling this is the leader, this is the guy you need to follow, not the other people in the group. But I guess speaking about barbarians, we really should touch on one area that I know is kind of like your dominant area of expertise, which of course is Berserkers. And your excellent book, The Myths and Realities of the Viking Berserker, looks at all of this in terms of berserkers. Like, why do we think they ate magic mushrooms and wore loincloths or just bear skins and would go off and commit merry murder and then have a bit of a daze afterwards?
Yeah, yeah. I spent far too long researching Berserkr. Mm. Is that a sign of a wasted life?
No, it must have been
No.
interesting, because what
Oh
sparked
no.
the idea off? What sparked the idea?
I wanted to do a PhD, and it was a topic that I was particularly interested in. Um, I shall I begin at the beginning? Let us
Go
begin
on
at the beginning. Yeah. I've always been interested in Vikings and Norse mythology since as far as I can remember. My mother always said that it was because my grandma told us stories of our Norse forefathers or some such rubbish, but I don't remember that. And then, of course, you get into Dungeons and Dragons, and there's barbarians who go berserk and everything else, and it's super cool when you're 13 and 14, and you're thinking, whoa, this is awesome. Obviously, what was more awesome was actually learning to read Old Norse as doing my undergrad, and reading the Icelandic sagas and realizing that things were actually even more interesting when you looked at the reality instead of the rather superficial stereotypes. So after I did my master's in Viking and Anglo-Saxon studies, I thought I'd like to do a PhD, and I was casting around for something to do, and it took an absolute age to sort myself out and get the courage up to say, can I look at Berserkers, to Judith Yesh, who was going to be my supervisor. And then she said, oh, I guess. So, and I just thought, well, I would really like to look at this. I feel like there is room for something more in there, and I can adjust the perception of them slightly. And also, it would give me an excuse to read all about them. And yeah, it kind of snowballed from there when I realized that I'd gone into it thinking completely incorrectly about the whole thing. Once you start looking at the
probably the benefit
evidence,
of it, isn't it?
oh, it was fantastic. It was like there was a light bulb moment where I suddenly thought, nobody's actually asked if they went berserk. Everybody says, how did they go berserk? Nobody takes the first step. You know, it's not, you can't ask how without asking, did they? And then reading the text and getting into it, I realized that actually the medieval audience probably didn't think they went berserk because they're not associated with berserk words. And so a lot of the perception that we have of them comes from people's translations. So people will read a translation, and the translation says, he went berserk and did this, that, and the other. But that's a translator's interpretation. That's not the actual text. So, and yeah, it snowballed from there, really. But my interest still remains in that topic. And which is why I'm here happily talking about it. But also, I also feel like the book probably provides everything I should have said, if not in all, even if all the words are not in exactly the right order that I would like them to be in. It's a topic where I keep coming back and thinking, should I have said it this way to help people understand what I'm thinking? So, but it's interesting because once you actually start looking at the source material, then you realize that if you're going to analyze the topic properly, you've got to try and understand what the medieval saga audience thought about it, because we only know the word from the Old Norse literature, which means that if we did not have that Old Norse literature, we would not have Viking Berserkers.
No, that's true.
We would have depictions of people wearing wolf skins from a very small number of places in Scandinavia, plus plus from other places in Europe, but we wouldn't actually have the word berserk. So you cannot start your analysis by asking how did they go berserk. You've got to start your analysis by asking how are they depicted in Old Norse literature. When you start doing that, you've got to then remember that Old Norse literature is not reportage. It is a view of the Viking Age past from an outsider's perspective. Yes, people are living in a development of that culture, but they're not actually part of that culture. So they're reporting what they saw, not what they understood. It's a bit like Ibn Fadlan watching a Volga Rus burial, and what he's reporting is what he understands of it, which isn't necessarily what the participants understood of it. So yeah, that's kind of where it went and where it came from. And then I looked at the sagas as literature, and I thought, hang on a minute, going berserk doesn't fit with how this literature is constructed. And then I looked at what words were associated with the word Berserksgangar, which is usually translated as Berserker Fury or went berserk, and realized that anger words are not part of it. There is literally one example of the word Other associated with it, and Other is the word which became Odin's name as well, meaning madness or fury. So of all the instances of encountering Berserkr, there is literally one who is associated with that word. And the circumstances of his going berserk, in the modern English sense of the word, are that he's just heard that his son's died, so he kills the messenger.
Kind of understandable.
I mean, he was clearly upset. He obviously liked his son. So when you actually start looking at it in more detail, you just realize that there is a lot more going on here, and the medieval audience probably understood things differently. And that means that in the Viking Age, it is more likely that something close to what's being depicted in the medieval sources was happening than that all the various ideas about people going berserk and eating magic mushrooms or just being hungover or whatever that come after, because of how language develops. The language has developed from the Viking Age, the medieval period, to now. So our modern word means something different. But that also is a problem, because our modern word is so ubiquitous that it's almost impossible to take the step back from it to look at the past and see the past differently. And yeah, it was a rabbit hole. I'm just going to say that.
I completely relate. I feel like there's a lot more I could do with Valkyries just generally, certainly in terms of their depiction, because I'm not a historian, I haven't studied history, I haven't even studied mythology professionally at any level. I just read lots of books, like yours, and get lots of ideas. And I've always been fascinated by the idea of kind of like exploring how people represent the Valkyries choosing the dead. And of course, the bigger question of, were they subservient to Odin, or did they have anything with Freya, or were they more independent and just kind of like used as a go-between, like the ferryman in Greek mythology? Because you can only get across the river Styx without the ferryman. Without the ferryman, how do you get across the river Styx? You can't. So but then he's not got anyone telling him what to do. But of course, that's a whole other debate. It's certainly, to touch back on almost like the Monty Python. Of course, Eric the Viking went from a book to being a film that was very different from the book in many, many ways. But it's something I discussed with Dr. Chris Tuckley, formerly of York Archaeology, but now working at Selby Abbey. He pointed out kind of like how the image of the Berserker there was just kind of like uncontrollable frenzy and frothing at the mouth, and it was all comically spewed from having a very persistent father telling him that he's doing everything wrong.
Oh yeah, I mean, Sven the maddeningly calm is a fantastic berserker figure. You know, telling his son, look, no, you've got to control it. You've got to keep it in until the right moment instead of going berserk all the time.
It's actually made me think now. I wonder if there was an element of berserkerness that inspired the creation of the Hulk in the Marvel film, because of course he's typically, I'm always angry, and then I just turn green and let it all out.
I mean, it's hard to tell if it's Viking related, but it's clearly Berserk related, yes. The Hulk, Wolverine, probably other characters that don't immediately spring gazelle-like to mind, all have these berserker fits. Yeah, they
Yeah.
are, they are the epitome of modern ideas of what it is to be a berserker.
Mm. It certainly becomes synonymous with excessive anger, if not excessive violence, which stems from excessive anger.
Which is why people find it so very hard to step away from it and actually look more
Mm.
dispassionately at the medieval sources. Yeah.
Mm. But I do appreciate kind of like explaining for viewers and listeners how it's not just kind of the language difference and language development over centuries that has influenced our understanding, perception, and meaning, but also kind of how the sources that we do have that mention it are also from a time outside of the time it was commonly witnessed, accepted, and better understood, I suppose, more relatable to the people of that time. So especially kind of like when I'm looking at Norse mythology, of course, most people go straight to kind of like Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda because it's more easy to read than the Poetic Edda. But of course, he was a man, he was a Christian, and he was writing it with a set agenda and a bias that wouldn't have existed at the time when those stories were better and wider known, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Snorri's an interesting example because he did try to write things down so that the poets of his day could understand them. His goal wasn't preserving the Norse mythology per se, it was helping people understand the old poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote the stories down, but we're also pretty sure that he structured things in a way that they wouldn't have been structured in the Viking Age.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we know that Viking Age religion was intensely personal. You had a personal relationship with the gods. You did not need intercessors or intermediaries to make your sacrifices to the gods. And that it was a lived religion, not something you just did on Sundays.
Mm.
So, and Snorri systematized that to some extent to make it more coherent in his work.
Mm.
But he also, I mean, he employed historical method as well. His explanations of why he trusts skaldic verse are interesting, and fit, because it's he had various ideas about skalds would not lie to their lords or overly flatter them, things like that. It's all in his introduction uh, to,
Mm.
to the Edda. So he's he's an interesting character in a lot of ways, but what he's presenting is not the religion as it was lived necessarily by
Mm.
people living in the north of Sweden or the south
Mm-hmm.
of Denmark or whatever or wherever.
Mm.
We can see from place names that different areas have different focuses in terms of which gods seem to be favored.
Mm.
And Snorri is writing, I mean, he was at the court in Norway, but he was writing in Iceland, so he's presenting a more Icelandic perspective as well. And this is another issue with the sagas, that a lot of them are written
Mm.
down in Iceland, and
Mm-hmm.
only a few of them are known from Norway and from other places. So you have that geographical bias as well as the distance from the time they're describing.
Yeah, it's a shame because I know kind of like the other Edda is the Poetic Edda, and I have Caroline Larrington's translation, and that was a core piece of my own independent Valkyrie research because, of course, when I was looking at primarily the legend of Brynhild, it's hard to not acknowledge Brynhild's legend without looking at the other sagas that feature Valkyrie characters, although not as dramatically as Brynhild's own kind of like arrival and ending. Um, like the legend, the second poem of Helgi Hundingsbane or Hundingsbane, whichever way you want to pronounce it. I always butcher it. Kind of how it mentions in kind of like almost like a footnote from the person who was writing it down, who we don't know, and we don't know who they heard this story from. They mentioned, oh yes, there was this other poem called The Song of Kara, and they reincarnated, and that's now lost. And I'm like, that's such a tease for the generations of centuries of future people to that who are studying this thing. Kind of like, there was other stuff, but we don't have it because someone decided it wasn't worth writing down, or they couldn't find someone who knew it. And of course, the people who were writing it down, as this one says, they kind of like, they described the theory of reincarnation as an old wives' tale. So they clearly had moved on from that perception, that belief, that understanding. Plus, they were clearly Christian, probably. Because of course, the Christians were the ones that were literate, not necessarily the original pre-Christian people that worshipped these gods and believed in these stories and had these skulls telling them orally for decades, if not centuries.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by literate, because we do have runes from the Viking Age and before as well. So people were carving written texts, and we have to assume that if somebody is carving a runestone, they expect other people to be able to read it. The problem with those is that they are short texts that don't actually give us the information that we get written down in the medieval period in Iceland. So, and we don't know what we've lost unless it's mentioned in a footnote. You know, we could have had, there could have been versions of these stories that got made into bishops' mitres somewhere, and they've never reappeared. So, yeah, we're looking through a keyhole at the past.
Oh, the best, I like to describe it as a jigsaw with half the piece missing. But we don't know they're missing until, because we're still building what we can with the pieces that are left.
Yeah.
Trying all the pieces that don't fit and wondering why they don't fit. But going back to Berserkers, of course, kind of like the most recent depiction that I think of Berserkers is, of course, in the Northman film. Did you watch it, and what were your thoughts?
I did watch it. I watched it with an archaeologist friend, and I spent more time watching him and his face, to be honest. I wasn't engaged by the movie The Northman. I was interested to see how they depicted Berserkers in it. There's a bit where Ulfhethnar, the guys with the wolf skins on, are dancing around, and I thought, well, this kind of fits in function, if not in form, my ideas about what was going on in the Viking Age. The idea that Berserkr was a ritual that you did before a fight. And we don't see it before battles in the saga literature. We do see it before duels. So maybe it's actually intimately associated with Holmgang. Not 100% sure on that. Perhaps it was something that was performed before a battle, in the same way that Tacitus 1,000 years earlier described, well, 800 years earlier, describes Germanic warriors chanting behind their shields to try and scare the enemy. So the idea that it's a performance that it is what struck me, especially after reading the sagas where you get more detailed descriptions of what's going on. And I mean, I always use Egil's saga because it's the most complete example, but this is not cherry picking. This is general across all of the examples. So in Arvarod's saga, you get a group of berserks chanting on their ship, and then they all rush up onto land to fight. But it's kind of like there's a pause between the fight and the chanting. In Egil's saga, it's even more pronounced. The guy does the Berserkr, the Uttrin Blakey does the Berserkr. Egil starts getting impatient, says, "Look, are you ready yet?" Says, "Not yet," and carries on. So Egil composes a poem slighting him, a poetry slam kind of thing going on, putting him down. Then they fight. Then they have a rest because they're a bit tired. So they go, "Oh, can we have a rest now?" So Egil composes a bit more poetry and basically slamming the guy again. Then he kills him afterwards when they carry on their fight. There is nothing in the pacing of that narrative that suggests that this Berserkr, Uttrin Blakey, Jot the Pale, has gone berserk. The distinct narrative pauses indicate that, in fact, he's in control. and that what he's doing before the duel is something else. And to my mind, then that means it's some kind of a ritual function. Every archaeologist says it's all ritual, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. It's some kind of ritual where he's trying to build himself up for the fight, possibly scare Egil, who's not easily scared by anything, but he didn't know that. It may have had some kind of magico-religious function in the Viking Age, because he's performing it before a ritual duel. In which case, given that Berserkr seemed to be associated with Odin, it might be to actually get the god on his side for this forthcoming fight. These are all things that are lost, and all we actually have is a description by somebody who is outside this milieu, and effectively saying, I saw, equivalent to saying, I saw this on TV and this is how I interpret it. So, it's very likely that Berserksgangur wasn't going berserk. It was more of a ritual that was performed. If it had magical function, it could have done. The connection is incredibly tenuous, but in Havamal 156, there is Odin's 11th spell is chanting under the shield to take people safely into battle and bring them home again.
Interesting.
Which immediately made me think of Tacitus's Baratus, the Germanic warriors chanting behind the shield. And then I thought, well, is this related to what's going on with Berserkr chewing the shields?
I was going to say, yes, there's the Lewis Chessman biting his shield, and he's often been described as a berserker.
Yeah, I mean, that's a medieval pop culture depiction of a Viking Age archetype. Worth remembering that they're not actually Viking Age, those gaming pieces.
Yes, they're not.
So they're what the medieval people thought a Berserk might have looked like. So potentially, what you've got going on is either chewing on the shield is metaphorically raising the shield above the mouth, or, as happens in one Irish source, there's a legal text which I've been told about but not actually found, where they plant the teeth in the top of the shield and do the chanting behind the shield from that.
Oh gosh.
So
quite a mouthful.
Literally, yes. So potentially you've got this idea of the shield being brought up in front of the mouth, and then some kind of magical spell being chanted, which would fit with the idea of Galder, which is described as like cocks crowing or whatever, and also fits with the idea of the various words used of Berserk's bellowing. We usually describe them as howling, but the actual words used are more like sort of bulls and similar animals. So if you've got this really sort of macho, gruff bellowing going on behind the shield as well, you've actually potentially got all the elements of how berserks are described in the sagas, biting on the shield, bellowing, and all the rest. The problem is linking that one verse in Havamal to the actual saga texts, but the resemblances are striking, so I'm going to do a bit of but hey, this looks like it might be right. So with that then means that Berserkr are associated with dueling. We know they're associated with elite kings from sagas like Rolf's saga, so with being part of the bodyguard. We know that they're often associated with Odin, and we know that they do weird stuff that people in later times have gone, oh my god, they're absolute nutters because we don't understand this, because we're looking at it from outside. And all of these together indicate that you have elite warrior types who are functioning as king's champions, like Charlemagne's knights or King Arthur's knights, as his personal bodyguard and doing stuff for them. That they're associated with duels, which means that potentially some people who went round challenging other to duels were called Berserkr because they did the dueling bit and performed this ritual. There's a lot going on, and the real issue here is that we just have no Viking Age sources that actually talk about that tell us it. And when we try to relate it to the archaeology, we're making connections, but those connections might not have existed to the Viking Age people who produced the like the Torslander helmet plates with the wolfskin figure and the horned helmeted figure on it, which are generally thought to be Odin leading the Ulfheden into battle. It's entirely possible that something else is being depicted there, or that it's not actually going into battle, it's the pre-battle ritual or the pre-duel ritual. Then you've got ideas like Neil Price has put out that the war leader embodied Odin. The article that he published on the Sutton Hoo helmet, where there's no reflective film behind the garnets above one of the eyes, suggesting that this then was a one-eyed helmet, even though the person wearing it had two eyes. And thus they were cosplaying Odin in a ritual, in a Viking Age. Well, actually, it's pre-Viking Age for that one. But, you know, the kings might be embodying Odin at particular times as the king of the gods, leader of the gods. The king then becomes Odin in people's minds, intimately connected. And again, because they're associated with Odin, we're coming back to this thing in Havamal, Sayings of the High One, this verse in there. It's an Odinic spell. It is the religion's personal, therefore the people performing these rituals probably have a personal connection to the god and are seen to be the most appropriate person to actually do this because of that personal connection. And breathe.
Yes, and David Usness, you can find all that and more in his book, The Myths and Realities of the Viking Berserker, because that is a wonderful whirlwind walk through it, and I can't wait to read it personally. It's got me thinking more about kind of like the way, particularly kind of like in the pop culture sense, kind of like how they're represented, such as kind of like in D&D. Never thought actually, thought, oh yeah, barbarians in D&D do have that kind of like, I would like to rage, as Grog says, Critical Role kind of thing. And how they're represented, because I think the only other time I've come across it recently was in a historical fiction novel written by Angus Donald called The Last Berserker, and he presents them very much as an elite, slightly reclusive, if not secretive, cult society where it involves tribes, groups of people being assigned to different animal totems and animal spirits and connecting to that rage through animals and doing impossible things, basically. But it was very deeply spiritual and kind of like more as a cult / following, as you say, like religious practice more than actual kind of like just seeing the enemy like, okay, switching on Berserk, go. They all had certain steps that they had to do before they could go for it, or certain connections spiritually more than physically that they had to do.
Oh yeah, and as Charlotte Hensviana Jonsson actually says in an article, people going berserk and suddenly charging out of the shield wall will actually be counterproductive because it creates gaps in the shield wall. So that kind of spontaneous berserking would be to the detriment of warfare in this period, and therefore would likely be frowned on. But I shall also add there that there are examples of people going berserk in the sagas, but they are not people who are described as Berserkr. So we see it at Vinheather in Egil's saga, where Egil's brother throws his shield behind him, either onto his back or just behind him, and charges into the enemy, striking out on both sides so no one could stand against him. And that is mirrored in Harald's saga, where at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harald Hardrada does exactly the same.
Really? I never knew that. That's interesting.
So you actually have Berserkr episodes. You also find it in Das Nibelungenlied. Hagen does it at one point when they're besieged in the hall towards the end before they all die horribly.
Mm.
So, you know, it's more than just a Scandinavian trope, that.
Mm.
But those figures are never associated specifically with the word Berserk.
Mm.
So it suggests that this is a different literary trope being used. And the fact that it exists in Middle High German as well suggests that it's more ubiquitous than purely Scandinavian. So it's not Viking Berserkers as such.
Mm.
So, yeah. And I suppose the other thing that's interesting is that apart from precisely 2 references from the 14th century, Berserkr do not appear after about pretty much after the year 900 in the
Really?
literature, roughly speaking.
Mm.
So they are not part of the King's sagas
Mm.
at the time of Harald Hardrada, for example.
Mm.
So when people talk about a berserker holding the bridge, that's basically romantic
Yeah.
embellishment of
Mm-hmm.
what was going on.
Mm.
But so, yeah, they don't really exist. But I do know of 2 actual historically attested berserkir that are not part of the literature. So
Ah.
both from the mid 14th century. One of
Mm.
them is in the will of a monk in Oslo, who says he wants to
Oh.
be buried in St. Olvard's Church in Oslo, next to
Mm-hmm.
his kinsman Ogmund Berserk. So the
Oh.
guy is buried in the church in a Christian context,
Mm.
and he has the title master, which means he's clerical. He's not, you know, so
Mm.
he's actually part of the church. So no idea why he has
Mm.
the nickname Berserk, but Ogmund Berserk is buried in St. Olvath's Church in Oslo, unless they've removed the bones from there now. So you can stand on the spot roughly where he's buried if you
Mm-hmm.
visit there. And then you have another one, Thorir Berserk, who's busy paying tithes to the church on behalf of his wife and stepdaughter. And that's recorded in a document from the mid 14th century as well.
Interesting. Oh, I never thought to look at it from a language point of view. Certainly, considering I'm an English degree student, or graduate, I should say, more than student, it certainly makes a lot of sense to look at how language has shaped and evolved and changed. That understanding. Gosh.
Oh, yeah. And has been
Ah.
shaped by the post-medieval research as well. All our perceptions about Berserkir actually stem from starting with Stefan Stephanius in the mid 17th century,
Ah.
and then further research going on from there. So he said they were possessed by black magic, and Odin they were possessed by demons summoned by Odin as the
Mm.
black magician. And then everybody else from then has gone, oh yeah, okay, well, that's obviously not right because we're not religious now, because this is the age of reason. So we're going to look at Siberian mushroom taking practice,
Mm.
which is a whole nother thing. And then every generation revises the perspective on what Berserkir were based on, whatever the latest scientific theories are. So the most recent stuff is all PTSD.
Mm.
These were people with PTSD, and so they just popped because of that, which all stems
Mm.
from, I mean, it starts with shell shock in the First World War and then
Mm.
develops to PTSD after Vietnam, where people actually did go berserk and threw off their flak
Mm.
jackets and attacked. And they have interviews with these people, but that doesn't make them berserkir. It makes
No.
them berserkers, which is a different thing entirely.
Mm.
So people keep looking at that past reality from a lens of the present, and very few people actually go back and analyze the medieval literature as well to understand it.
Mm.
So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, certainly talking to you, it's made me realise that kind of like, as well as the conception of them having kind of like crazed mindsets, going into a frenzy, whether it's mushroom induced or ritual induced, but also kind of like the bare skin, the furs, that are kind of like having very, very vulnerable, but yet fiercely determined to throw themselves into dangerous situations. The other examples you mentioned show that there are berserkers that also were kind of like well equipped, well armed. It wasn't just kind of like throwing everything off and going to the will of the gods. They they did it in the typical fashion of going into battle, and that you would put armor on and have a shield and have a weapon of some description.
Yeah. I mean, I have wondered if they wore bearskins actually as armor,
Mm.
because a bearskin is quite hard to cut with a sword, which would also fit with the idea that you couldn't actually cut them, so you had to beat them to death with a blunt object, which occurs in the
Mm.
sagas. Because a bearskin, again, would not protect you very well from massive
Mm.
trauma damage. If somebody clobbers you hard with a big heavy mallet or what have you, you'll still feel
Mm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
So I've wondered about that, but that's really even more speculative than I'm willing to go to. Uh,
Mm.
and it has been called into question on the grounds that a bearskin would be too heavy to wear. But then again, were they wearing a whole bearskin? They weren't stupid
Mm.
either. So they could have tailored these things to make their armor. And there is a line in one saga which basically says that they had wolf skins for armor,
Mm.
specifically for armor.
Mm.
So wearing a heavy leather jacket will protect you from a lot of cutting damage in theory.
Yeah.
So yeah. And in terms of how I've always envisaged them as warriors, I always envisage them as being something like the Parachute Regiment or the French Foreign Legion,
Mm.
applying massive amounts of highly controlled aggression to the situation,
Mm.
and controlling it that way with absolute confidence in their own abilities, because they are the elite warriors, which
Mm.
again is likely means that they were probably descended from Berserkr as well, because the people who were in that position would get the best food and be the biggest and the strongest and brought up to it.
Mm.
And the question then is, how far back does the tradition go? When does the word actually emerge? Because if it relates to bears, then Björn is a Viking Age word, which means that an earlier Beran, meaning bear, has to be pre-Viking Age, so they would have been part of that
Mm.
pre-Viking Age society. Uh, so yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a lot we cannot know, but
Mm.
again, as I will constantly say, you have to look at the medieval sources, not the post-medieval analysis, and
Mm.
work with the medieval sources on their own basis, on their own premise.
Mm.
So yeah, that's Berserkers in a nutshell.
Mm. Well, certainly kind of like, as you say, all the gaps in knowledge that we don't have because of the way the sagas, as you say, were recorded out of their time by people out of that time, not witnessing or understanding what they were recording fully, kind of like in an authentic sense. It's certainly allowed, as we discussed, kind of like with Vikings and indeed with Valkyries, kind of like creative interpretation, creative license to really flourish, because there's no one around today that can say, no, that wasn't true, that didn't happen. We can say on some things that they didn't happen, or more likely that they didn't happen, but it's always, to a degree, we cannot be 100% accurate or definite,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
and the sources we're working with are more like historical fiction than history as
Mm.
well, which is the other
Mm-hmm.
issue. A lot of these sources, people originally thought of them as being actual descriptions of the past, and a
Mm.
lot of people still approach them in that way, read them in that way, but they're
Mm-hmm.
actually much more like historical fiction. It's a bit like analysing the Viking Age by reading Giles Christian's books, or, you know,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
I love those books, but
Mm.
they're not history, they're historical fiction.
Yes.
And even though the Icelanders who wrote these things down appear to have thought of what they were writing down as history,
Mm.
we need to understand that it isn't really, it's not reportage.
No. No, and I think that can stem a lot to kind of like even the mythology kind of side of things, because I often think, having dived so deep into kind of like the saga of the Volsungs and the Poetic Edda and Brynhild and Sigurd Fafnir's Bane kind of like storytelling, I like to think that when they were orally told by different people in different regions of Scandinavia, or even in Iceland, because of course even the Nibelungliad, which was more Germanic than Scandinavian, that even the Skalds would have twisted and changed things depending what audience they were telling to, the kind of like the time, kind of like, because storytelling is so creative, it's so free, it's not rigid, it's not set. Even kind of like with the invention of the printing press, we still have 101 different types of Vikings in 101 different authors, and equally Berserkers are included in that spectrum of interpretation. There'll be a
Yeah,
core idea, and it will have just evolved and got a spectrum of things. So,
I mean, the
but
other thing I'm going to throw out there then is
go on.
also they may have manifested differently in different parts of Scandinavia.
Mm, that's
So
true.
again, um, what we're seeing is what's been codified in Iceland, but it's possible that a Eastern Swedish Berserkr would have functioned, well, not functioned, performed differently
Yes.
from a Western Norwegian one, for example.
Mm,
So there's that. And the other thing to add to it is, of course, the manuscript traditions show that the sagas were written down in multiple variants as well.
mm-hmm,
There are differences between them. So
mm-hmm,
again, you've got different stories cropping up. So when we read a translation, that is not the saga. It is a
mm,
saga translated and interpreted by someone. When I work with an Old Norse text, more often than not, it's an edition, which is a compilation of various manuscripts because there are gaps in one manuscript because mice ate it or whatever.
mm,
And we filled in the gap from a different manuscript, but we can't guarantee that what existed on that page that's disappeared
mm-hmm,
was what we've actually substituted it with, but we've produced
mm.
a story. So,
Yes, we humans love to find patterns and things, and when we can't fill in a pattern, we fill in the gap.
yep, that's it. And
Ah,
that's what we've done.
mm-hmm.
And that is
Oh,
why
well,
subsagas exist in multiple variants still.
mhm. Well, I think a lot of people would find this book really interesting, and I will when I eventually have the time and opportunity to read it. But it is here; I have it in my hands on my bookshelf, so I will do it at some point. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you about all of this, Rory, and of course, I wish you luck in your current position at Stavanger and all the fun things that you're doing there. And hopefully one day we'll get you back on again soon.
Yep, yep, thank you. Thank you for giving me a soapbox.
It's been really good. I've really enjoyed it. It's been really insightful for me personally, and I hope our viewers and listeners have enjoyed learning more about where berserkers and berserker are coming from, and have a change of perception themselves.
Yep, or just think about how they approach the sources.
Mhm.
That's the other thing. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed the discussions between my special guests and myself. Please do check out the episode blurb for links to their works and websites. If you liked this episode, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. Let me know if you learned something new in the comments. And of course, click subscribe to Valhalla Conversations wherever you are listening or watching. We hope you can join us in Valhalla again soon for more conversations.